So after playing Crown and Skull with its attrition system, I also looked um, at a video by a gentleman. I think he was the designer of the game Tales from Elsewhere, and he also had a crunchy combat system without hit points, and he had a novel injury system. I thought it was actually, let's say novel. I should say it was a decent injury system that indeed didn't use hit points. Instead, you had effectively slots for, grazes for all intents and purposes, injuries, critical injuries, lethal injuries, which reminded me a lot of, say, the old Mutants and Masterminds. I don't know what Mutants and Masterminds does today, but I remember before they used to have a similar system based on how badly you failed your toughness roll. You had to mark off one or more of these slots. Now, we could get clunky and talk about how that's really just a hit point system in disguise, but neither here nor there. I thought the system that the guy described was actually pretty clever. The way that he did damage and injury, and I thought that actually was pretty cool. I think Crown and Skull. I think the system is cool also. I think the idea of losing your skills and equipment as you get injured in lieu of hit points, it is not a terrible system. It's pretty interesting. Um, it probably leads to a lot of pretty desperate situations in the game. So certainly a neat, valid way. And I thought Crown and Skull that was novel, right? I'd never seen that before. One thing about so a lot of the times though when people talk about, well, I want to get rid of hit points, and I'm not saying that the author of Crown and Skull did that. I'm not saying that the author of Tales from Elsewhere did that. But there is often a discussion. Why do you want to get rid of hit points? Well, because they're old, they're outdated, they serve no narrative purpose, they're futzy, they're wargamey. There's a lot of reasons why people want to get rid of hit points, and a lot of times there is a little bit of at least in my opinion, an attitude of they're an outdated way to think about um, injury or right staying power, and we should get rid of them because of that. And I do. It's funny because I do think I I think it's interesting because I think a lot of people don't realize historically that debate has literally been going on since the inception of D&D and hit points in D&D. Like the earliest issues of Dragon magazine had discussions about whether hit points made any sense. Um, literally the questions of, well, why can I fight if my fighter has 90 hit points? Why can I fight for 89 of those hit points? I can take sword shot after sword shot and arrow after arrow and be fine until the last one, and then I keel over dead, and literally be fighting at 100% until I fall over dead. You know, it makes no sense that I can jump off of a 100-foot ledge and survive if I'm a high level character. What does that mean, right? What do hit points represent? And in fact, there was an article I think that Gygax wrote specifically about, well, it's your luck, it's your fatigue, it's your heroic skill in battle that allow you to mostly dodge the attack and dodge that attack and so on until finally the last one wears you out. And you then take the killing blow to your heart. And whether or not that makes any sense, because then people talked about that. Well, then what does cure wounds do? Does it refresh your skill? Because that doesn't make any sense because there's no wounds through that second explanation that Gygax just threw out there. There are no wounds until you actually are then killed. So we've been talking about this for 40 years, if not more. Actually, it's more than 40 years, 45 years, easy. Um, about what hit points represent and what they mean. The one thing I think that you should be aware of that if you're, I mean, it's fine to decide, well, I want to do something new, because doing something new is part of the really the point of the hobby. So never, always, there's no reason not to try new crap and new systems and go, well, instead of, having 30 hit points, why doesn't my guy have whatever, 6 wound slots, and or 10 pieces of gear that they have to go through? That's perfectly fine. That's part of the gaming hobby. So I'm all for it. But one thing I think you should realize is, and this, I think this is lost on a lot of people, um, is that, remember that the old versions of D&D, advanced and basic before it, weren't really focused on an individual combat as a set piece. There might have been set piece combats, and I do remember some pretty epic ones from old campaigns back, in high school or whatever. But but generally, an individual combat was not a highlight of the evening. It was something, you did it, you got it done. They were fairly quick, and you moved on to the next one. That was part of a larger dungeon expedition. And as you dragged your 2 or 3 fighters and mage and cleric and thief into the dungeon, and your henchmen and your gear into the dungeon, remember, you were there was a logistics component to it. And I always say that old school D&D is, the focus of the game isn't the combat, it is the expedition, the logistics of the expedition. That's why shopping was such a big deal. That's why poring over, your first adventure, poring over that list and going, well, I need rope and I need 6 torches, and all of that was super important, and really was part of the fun. Like, when it's hard to explain, I think, to some folks that didn't experience that firsthand. When you first played, you were like, wow, this is amazing. You are planning to go into this deep delve, this tomb or whatever, or on this adventure, and it was an interesting experience, which I don't think is quite matched by later versions of D&D. I think the expectation is different, and the way that the adventures are presented, and the game itself is different. But if you look at it that way, if you look at it in the old school way, which is that this is a logistics problem we're trying to solve. Well, okay, you can carry 6 torches. I'll carry a lantern. I have some oil. We'll use a couple for light, but I'll keep a couple in case we have to throw them and put down some fire between us and the goblins. We've got our stuff. We have our low level characters, so we have a couple heal spells. We have one, or maybe a sleep spell, maybe a magic missile or something else in the group. And the fighters all have a handful of hit points, essentially, the meat shields. And we're heading on down. The whole thing was a press your luck game. Your job as an adventuring party was to go into the dungeon, explore as many rooms as you thought you could. But the GM was putting pressure on you, from the encounters, the traps, the tricks, etc. in the dungeon, but also with, say, the wandering monsters and ticking off your resources. So as your torches went down and we made wandering monster rolls, that decision was always there. Should we turn back? And the idea was, well, if you turn back, then the monsters that you have cleared might respawn. Only this time they might not have any treasure, because they're new monsters, right? Or you took that treasure. Or maybe the kobolds would have built a bunch of traps, or maybe the orcs would have gotten reinforcements and they'll be ready for you next time. So going back had a penalty associated with it. And you had to make that decision as to when we're going back. Now, typically, the idea of going back was, we need to go back because we don't have we don't have enough resources. Our mages are out of spells. Or whatever. Our cleric's out of heals, or one fighter's down to 2 hit points. Right? At some point, you would have to make that decision. And then at that point in time, when you turn back, the whole thing was, am I going to be able to? We going to be able to get out of here, or are we going to find out that our mapper screwed up the map? or that there's a trap that we missed on the way, or is there going to be a wandering monster that's going to close off our escape route? And you were always pushing, realizing that it was possible that when you turned around, you went too far and that you were now stuck dead in the dungeon or desperate in the dungeon. So, what the hell does this have to do with hit points? Well, hit points are simply a microcosm of that sort of gameplay. Hit points is just another resource that ticks off, and all these resources are incremental. Your spells are incremental. Now, they might only have one increment of one, but your spells are incremental. But clerics in AD&D started with more than one, typically, because those heals were precious. You know, your potions, your torches, all those tick off. They're all incremental. There's no time when all of a sudden the GM, I mean, there might have been times, believe me, you might have, oh, we fell into a pool of water, now all our stuff's wet, so now we don't have light. Like that kind of stuff. That always was a possibility. But generally, there was not a case where all of a sudden the GM just said, well, all your stuff's gone, and now you're stuck in the middle of the dungeon. It was incremental. The game was, don't you want to go to another room? Only the next one might be the one that gets you stuck here and killed. Hit points are that. Hit points are sort of that game in the combat game. Their job is to essentially be plot armor. If you have 10 hit points, you have 10 points of plot armor. Those points of plot armor will be slowly whittled down by enemies and slowly and replenished by your clerics and whittled down by enemies again. And they're whittled down reasonably slowly because you need to be able to make the decision as to when to turn around and get out of dodge. It's part of that game. The narrative purpose they serve isn't, oh, you took an arrow to the arm and your arm numbs and the blood starts to flow down. I mean, yes, you could describe those injuries like that, and indeed, when you GM'd, if someone took a big hit, you might do that. But there was no critical hit system in D&D. People added them, but there was none originally. I think by design, because the idea wasn't that you would then take a whole chunk of your hit points or immediately be debilitated by a single shot. Though, interesting, when combat's a set piece, that is fascinating, and I like that, and we play like that, and and there were games of the era that did that, like Rollmaster, for instance. But D&D was built as a press your luck dungeon logistics game. And at some point, as your resource management game, right? As your resources dwindled, you needed to make the call and turn around. A high power injury system doesn't let you do that. If the two fighters in one round can get downed in a shot, that's not giving you that decision anymore. The tension point actually has gone away because you just drop because of random stuff. The actual tension is not, am I going to drop this hit because the goblin rolls a 20? It's, I have 6 hit points left. Those goblins are doing 1d4. If I take 1 or 2 shots, I'm not going to have enough for us to then get out, and when we turn around and get out. Or I'm going to use up the cleric's last cure light, and then we're going to be in trouble going around. And, right? That's sort of the idea. And that's the thing I think that we often miss in the discussion. What do hit points represent? They represent another ticker, another resource that is to be gently managed. And that's not really true in new versions of D&D, right? In 3rd edition, the focus dropped to combat. Like, it was set piece combat. Similarly, in 5th edition, the focus is on set piece combat. And don't get me wrong, there was always the ubiquity of the long rest or the night of rest. That absolutely happened. Now, mind you, in old D&D, you got a single hit point when you rested. And the clerics would then have to then heal you up. People would still rest in the dungeon, or at least attempt to. But then the GM would make a bunch of wandering monster checks throughout the night. So it usually was a rough haul to do that. But if you did, and you could sleep for 8 hours, and your clerics go, "Oh, my cure lights are back," so then they could hit you up and get the party back, but at the expense of the spells they then burned that they would not have for that day's adventuring. But the 15-minute day existed forever, also. Um, but that's the thing. That's sort of what I wanted to say. This one doesn't have to be long, but what I wanted to say to sort of point out was, hit points are like they are in basic and are like they are in advanced D&D and old school D&D because they're meant to be a metric that actually slowly ticks down to give you the chance to run. Because that's the actual tension, central tension of the game. Isn't is this is does this hit kill me? Now sometimes that is a tension and that's awesome, right? When you get down, oh, I'm down to 10 hit points, the dude does a D12 or D, a D8 plus 4. Yeah, that's tense. But in general, the central tension of old school D&D was, especially once you got to mid to high levels, of course, was how far are you going to go and how far are you going to press your luck? And those hit points are going down. And when do you pull the ripcord? That was the central tension. And sometimes you did it early, and sometimes you didn't do it early enough. Right? And there you go. So the fact that there's no injury system, the fact that hit points don't have a good narrative sort of meaning, is not really a flaw as much as it just is part of the core design. And the fact that nowadays, a lot of folks grew up with third and fifth as sort of their game of, their game. And those games are much more focused on combat. So having 100 hit points and then whittling those down, doesn't make quite as much sense as it does in first edition or first, second, and basic editions of D&D. So that's it. I'm here. I defended hit points, the honor of old school hit points. Yay, go me. And that's it. I will talk to you all later. Thank you very much.